You have to figure, unless you're talking about a team like the New England Patriots, that you usually have a certain window, a certain period of opportunity to be a playoff contender, potentially get yourself into the mix to win a Lombardi trophy. When you look at it, the Packers have made the playoffs almost every year that Aaron Rodgers has been the starting quarterback, but the gold standard being the New England Patriots, the Seahawks have made the playoffs 5 straight years. But in general, it's just really, really hard to make the playoffs 5 consecutive seasons. And the Cincinnati Bengals between 2011 and 2015 were able to do just that. But the problem is, it's one thing to get to the dance, it's another thing to actually perform well once you get to the dance. And for the Bengals, 5 straight playoff appearances, 5 straight one and dones. And at some point in time, there has to be a shit or get off the pot season, a shit or get off the pot type of moment where either the team finally takes that next step or that window of opportunity has ultimately evaded the organization and it's time to consider rethinking what you're doing, retooling, and perhaps rebuilding. And I looked at 2016 as that seminal moment in time for the Bengals. How many more seasons could they potentially have where they could get themselves into the playoff mix? Well, it was either going to be a big step forward or it was going to be a big step backwards. And unfortunately for the Cincinnati Bengals and their fans, 2016 was a little bit Bungle-esque. Not the Bungles of the 90s, mind you, but there was definitely a step backward. And you really have to be concerned with the future of this organization and where they're headed. Is this a team that can still be relevant, still be viable, still be competitive, still be a playoff caliber team? Will they ever get to a point where that really even matters, where they can actually contend once they get into the playoffs? Or have you seen the best of the Cincinnati Bengals? I guess ultimately 2017 is going to be a major determining factor in all that. And you look at this, there were a variety of factors that kind of played into the Bengals and ultimately the lost season that was. You had Tyler Eifert miss half the season. Gio Bernard missed 6 games. AJ Green, missed 6 games. So those are 3 really important pieces on the offensive side of the ball, especially in the passing game, in particular providing the big plays in the passing game that weren't at Andy Dalton's disposal for several games, a good portion of the season. And you look at Dalton's numbers, sometimes it's easy to pick on the Ginger, sometimes it's easy to pick on Dalton. And you look at it, his numbers weren't terrible. I mean, he did throw for over 4,000 yards, but he only had 18 passing touchdowns, which means that they just didn't have the red zone targets they had in years past because guys like Eifert missed half the year, AJ Green missed 6 games. You just look at it, and even though they were able to move the ball some through the air, not as well as they have in years past, and they most certainly didn't get the big plays in the passing game that they're built on, that they need in order to be in the playoff mix. And to be fair to them, the opening schedule was less than kind. Their first 4 games, you had a couple cupcakes in there, but lots of quality teams, lots of playoff teams, lots of playoff contending teams. Your first 8 games of the season, you're at the Jets, at the Steelers, you host Denver and Miami, then you go to Dallas, to New England, host Cleveland, host Washington. You look at Denver and Washington, they just missed the playoffs in their respective conferences. The Steelers and the Patriots, had deep runs in the AFC playoffs. The Patriots ultimately were the Super Bowl 51 champions. The Dallas Cowboys finished 13-3, had the best NFC record in the regular season. Miami snuck into the playoffs at 10-6. That was a really tough opening stretch of schedule. So as a result, it's not that much of a surprise, especially missing Eifert at the beginning portion of the season, to see this team go 3-4-1. But even at that point in time, you're like, oh, there's still plenty of time. You still got half the season. If you get hot, maybe you go like 10-5-1, 11-4-1, even 9-6-1. Maybe that would be good enough to get you into the playoffs. But then you turn around and lose your next 3 games at the Giants, home to Buffalo, and at the Ravens. And then at that point in time, the season was pretty much kaput. And while they split the difference in the AFC North, going 3-3, they were 2-4 against the rest of the AFC and just 1-2-1 against the NFC East. So, some bad luck, some bad timing, a less than pleasant schedule, just a variety of factors led to what happened with the Cincinnati Bengals in 2016. What really surprises me, though, is that Marvin Lewis is still the head coach. And I don't mean this to undermine Marvin Lewis, and I don't mean it just to totally crap on the dude, because it's easy to talk about where the Bengals are right now and forget about where they were, especially before Marvin Lewis got there. All the crap I talk about the Browns being the skid marks and this and that when it comes to the National Football League, the Jaguars nipping on their heels for being the worst organization in the NFL. For around an entire decade of the 90s, it was the Cincinnati Bengals. They were called the Bungles legitimately for a reason. And Marvin Lewis changed the trajectory of the franchise. Marvin Lewis eventually made the Cincinnati Bengals relevant and viable again. They actually matter in the grand scheme of things. He's been there 14 years. So you talk about in a division where you get lots of stability at the head coaching position from the organizations that get it, like the Pittsburgh Steelers with Bill Cowher before him, Chuck Noll, and currently Mike Tomlin, the Baltimore Ravens with John Harbaugh. You look at Marvin Lewis, he's been there 14 seasons. They made the playoffs 7 times, so it hasn't been all bad. But at some point in time, if you're Mike Brown, the owner and general manager, you're in your 80s, you probably want to see your team win a Super Bowl before you go to your grave. At some point in time, you have to ask the question, is Marvin Lewis just the type of Tony Dungy guy that came into a horrible situation and turned it around and changed the culture of the organization, but he's not the type of guy that can get you over the hump? And maybe it's best to go get somebody else that can help you take that next step, because 14 years is a long time to be an NFL head coach with one team, especially if you haven't enjoyed any real semblance of playoff success. Like, people always want to trash on Jeff Fisher, and deservedly so, especially for his run in St. Louis/Los Angeles. But when we compare Marvin Lewis to Jeff Fisher, that's an insult to Jeff Fisher, because Jeff Fisher actually won playoff games. He actually took a team to the Super Bowl and came this close to potentially winning one. So there's really not much of a comparison there. And I just find it striking that Marvin Lewis has so much power in that organization where he could just basically say, I'm coming back for year 15, and everybody's just okay with that, at least from the Bengals organization. I know the fan base isn't. The fan base is ready to move on, and frankly, they should be. Enough is enough, and it's time for a change. And if things don't change dramatically and significantly in 2017, it best be Marvin Lewis's last season in Cincinnati. Thanks for all you've done, but at the end of the day, you didn't get the total job done. It's that simple. Part of the reason I think, too, why the team kind of finds itself in this type of position where they've had some hits in the draft, like A.J. Green and Tyler Eifert. We have to throw Andy Dalton in there, Jeremy Hill, Gio Bernard. They've had some hits. But sometimes you look at their draft classes, and we've talked about the past few years how, they didn't seem to have a lot of glaring holes, so they would draft for best available player. It hasn't exactly worked out as well as maybe would have been anticipated. So what happens is your team gets older, especially on the defensive side of the ball, and some of the young talent you're looking to take over just isn't good enough. And then there's a significant drop off from the older aging starters to the younger backups. So it's not a surprise, I guess, that the Bengals find themselves in this position. And when you look at their 2016 draft class, it was one of those ones, again, just like some other years, that in theory looked really good on paper for the Bengals. William Jackson, the corner from Houston, I love the kid, but he missed his entire rookie season due to injury. Tyler Boyd, their second-round pick, had some moments, but he's not a big-time playmaker at the NFL level. You've got Nick Vigil, Andrew Billings. Maybe they could step up in year 2 and contribute more. Christian Westerman, he looks like he could be potentially a long-term starter at guard for this organization. But the fact of the matter is the Bengals need to get more out of the draft. Now, the good thing for them is, like a lot of teams this offseason, they'll have some salary cap flexibility. They've got some money to spend. Even though we're talking about Mike Brown, so good luck trying to get him to spend it all. They've got over $40 million in cap space. I think you look at the two biggest players that they have on the market. That'll be Kevin Zeitler and Drake Kirkpatrick. They're 2 first-round picks from 2012. Will they franchise Zeitler? Will they get a deal done with him? Or will they sit there and think that Westerman and maybe somebody else they can bring in can help fill that void and they can allow Zeitler to go? Remains to be seen. Drake Kirkpatrick, do you want to sit there and pay him big money knowing you've previously spent first-round picks on Darqueze Dennard and William Jackson? That remains to be seen. But this is the type of team that is tough because it's hard to put your finger on just what's ailing them. Because if you say it's Andy Dalton and Andy Dalton alone, you're fooling yourself. If you say that it's a lack of weapons to complement AJ Green on a consistent basis, that tells part of the story, but it doesn't necessarily tell the full story. The lack of a big time lead consistent running back, that again, that's part of the story, but it's not the whole story. The lack of speed in the linebacking core, the crappiness of the defensive tackle, whoever ends up lining up next to Geno Atkins, again, part of the story, but not the entire story. Lack of impact players in the secondary, especially at the safety position. Starting guys like mid-30s Pac-Man Jones at corner. So it's interesting because there's not any one thing you can point to and say, hey, if they fix this, this team will be right back in the mix again. It's just not that simple. What they do need, though, is they need a good draft. They need young, talented players that could come in and contribute in a hurry. And you might say, well, you could say that about any team, and that's absolutely true. But especially in the case of the Bengals, that window of opportunity to be in the playoff mix, if it hasn't closed already, it is closing and closing very rapidly. And henceforth, as a result, they don't necessarily need the rookie projects that you wait 2 or 3 years and you hope you got what you wanted out of them. You need those guys that come and step right in and be difference makers. In terms of where those difference makers need to come from, a linebacker, middle linebacker, frankly, outside linebacker, they have a need for youth, speed, just flat out talent at the linebacker position, period. I think they could use an explosive safety, free safety type of center fielder type that has great range and can make plays all over the place. They could definitely use some more depth on the defensive line, another defensive tackle, so maybe finally somebody can usurp D'Amato Pecco from the fucking starting lineup. They could use another edge rusher, that's for sure. On the offensive side of the ball, wide receiver in particular. Maybe Tyler Boyd is best suited as a slot option. You've got AJ Green. He's a legit number one. I don't know that they have a legit number two on their roster. And it would really help Andy Dalton in that offense in general if they could find a better, more consistent weapon opposite AJ Green. Because Eifert could be that guy, but Eifert misses so many damn games due to injury, you can't really count on him. You're at a point in time with Eifert where anything you get from him is a bonus, not anything expected or guaranteed. And that's the problem. You'll see a lot of mock drafts that have Reuben Foster from Alabama going number 9 to the Bengals. And frankly, that makes a lot of sense. He is exactly the type of rookie that the Bengals need. The guy that could come in and play immediately and make an impact. He would be a significant upgrade over Mauluga in the middle of that defense, and he could potentially be the type of guy that changes the entire tone and complexion of that defense. Sometimes you get that one guy that can do that. A guy like a Reuben Foster could do just that. But maybe they decide they want to really load up on offensive skill talent and they bring somebody like a Corey Davis and a Mike Williams into the mix. Again, it's a need. It's a pretty significant need. And I could understand why they would do it. If one of the two safeties, either Jamal Adams or especially Malik Hooker with the injury concerns, if one of them drops to 9, they would make a ton of sense too. The good thing for the Bengals is where they're sitting in the first round of the draft at number 9. They've got all their picks in each of the rounds, 1 through 7. They're picking at number 9 in round 1. The chances are they could get a marquee talent, and it happens to be at one of their major positions of need. And it doesn't always work out like that. Sometimes you pick out of surplus and just based off of talent. Sometimes you desperately try to fill need. It's interesting for the Bengals because they're in a position based off of where they're picking at number 9. They shouldn't necessarily have to move up. And they will be able to get somebody to fall into their laps potentially that could really make a difference for them day number 1 and maybe help this team turn it around a little bit in 2017 because that's what they need. Because if they don't get it in 2017, then it's time to consider moving on from Marvin Lewis and Andy Dalton, and it might be time to blow the Bungles up.